Yeah, go Mason. I always have to do the plug if I can. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So I want to talk about income inequality. It's a topic I've been writing on for a couple of years now. And I think that this is going to be the basis of the 2016 presidential election. It's an issue that's as old as time. You can read Shakespeare and read about the plight of the rich and the poor and how they live amongst one another. So it's not a new issue, but it has gotten reignited. And I think that both parties are probably going to make some incorrect claims, and that's probably being really generous. So I think we have to get clarity around what it is. How do we think about it using the economic way of thinking, which is what I do or try to do, and then kind of provide some context for policymakers. How do we hold them accountable for what we think is going to lead us to a more prosperous society? And I would say that my context for all of this is that we are after flourishing. I think flourishing is really a better word than prosperity. I think it's a more powerful word than well-being, although those kind of words are used interchangeably, I think. But flourishing is this idea of being able to wake up in the morning and say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to open a food truck. I'm going to be an accountant. I'm going to be a stay-at-home mom and have 4 children. And being free to choose what you deem to be best for your life. And so within that context, we work, we make income, we hire people, we do all sorts of different things. So we have to think about how our income and our earnings relate to this overall bigger idea of flourishing. So the context from me to you in terms of how I think about income inequality is, what are we really after? We're really after flourishing. How are people doing? How do we help the poor escape poverty? And what does it look like to live in the poorest quintile? These are all big questions. I realize that as an economist, I'm probably going to have more data or more numbers than maybe you normally get, which is, again, keep the beer flowing. That will make that more interesting as well. But I just I think it's important for this kind of conversation to show you some of the numbers so we can have a deeper, like I said, conversation. So Occupy Wall Street really, I think, reignited this issue. You all probably know what this is, but people literally went into cities and protested. And we pitted the 99% against the 1%, which frankly, as an economist, or I think just as anyone, this is not a helpful dichotomy. The 1%, and really what we hear about are the 1/100th of the 1% against the 99%. The 99% is a really big group of people. So if you're at the top of the 99%, you're living a very different life than if you're at the bottom of the 99%, but it's powerful rhetorically. And so the media has played into this. I think culture is playing into this. If you watch a movie, you're going to hear all this type of discussion. And so I think we have to really kind of unpack that. What does it mean? What does it look like? How do we understand it? And the way to start is by this idea of income and wealth. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make, and if you Googled income inequality, probably the first page you would get directed to would be a Wikipedia page, and it would say, see income equality, see wealth equality, see economic equality. So they make those kind of the same thing. We always talk about those in the same terms. They are different. I'm going to be talking about income inequality. Wealth is a much harder thing to measure. So the way that I think is helpful to understand this is if you turned on a bathtub and you filled it with water, what comes out of the spigot is income. What is left over in the bathtub is wealth. Okay, so income and wealth are different. Income is what we take home. Wealth is all of our assets. Okay, so those are two different things. I'm talking about income here. This is one of my favorite pictures from the Occupy Wall Street movement. I just totally hijacked this off of Google. This is not my picture. And it's a woman, and she has a sign in her hands, and it says, "One day the poor will have nothing left to eat but the rich." I don't know this woman. I don't know her plight. I don't know her circumstances. So this is in no way me making light of her circumstances because I don't know what they are. But the premise upon which she has, made this sign is incorrect, because it presumes that the only way the rich can get richer, i.e., earn more income, is if they take from somebody else. And when we think about this, we never think that applies to us. So I bet most of us, when we get up and we go to work in the morning, whatever that job may be, whether you're a barista at Starbucks or you're a truck driver or you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and anything else in between, you probably don't think that your job exploits somebody else. But we tend to levy that criticism against the top 1%, against the CEOs. The question is it true? Is it right? And I would say that the economic way of thinking really helps us get to the bottom of this. And the bottom of this is that in a society that has high levels of economic freedom, which is measured by a lot of different indices, the Heritage Foundation has one, the Fraser Institute has one. This is kind of how we measure the level of opportunities in a society, the ease of opening a business, these types of things. So these types of things are indicative of a society where if I open a business, I actually have the requirement upon me to serve my community, to serve my neighbor, to serve strangers. And that's the counterintuitive nature of the market process, is that when we get to decide what we want to do, the only way to make long-standing profits over time is to serve other people, whether you're an accountant or a barista at Starbucks. And so the idea that income is a zero-sum game is actually incorrect. Now, in some societies, wealth is a negative-sum game. If you live in, Bangladesh right now, it might behoove you to plunder. It might behoove you to be in the political elite because you have your boot on the backs of the population. But in a society with economic freedom, generally what we see is that people thrive. They make a lot of money when they serve people. And that's why Apple and Microsoft battle it out, right? To give us better things that are faster, that are lower cost over time. And this is really important. It gets us towards flourishing. Okay. So I think her presumption is wrong. I think the media's presumption is wrong. And I think we don't consistently apply the criticism. We tend to only apply it to people we don't like. We, meaning the general population, not you. Right? Like hedge fund managers, people that work on Wall Street, they're shady. We don't like them. But we don't apply it to, kind of some sort of middle class profession. So I think that's one critique. We need to hold the media accountable. We need to hold ourselves accountable for how we're thinking about this. So I want to talk a little bit about how economists understand income inequality, what it means, how we measure it. And we'll go through some technical stuff, but it's not going to be difficult. So economists measure income inequality in a population based on something called the Gini coefficient or the Gini score. And it ranges from 0 to 1. A score of 1 means perfect income inequality. It quite literally means that one person has the income and everybody else has nothing. I do not want to live in that world unless I have all the income, right? Does not sound good. There's going to be corruption and bribery and oppression and lots of bad things. A Gini score of 0 is perfect income equality. It quite literally means we all have the same income. Now, if we think about it in those terms, where do we think most people want to live? Closer to 0 or closer to 1? What do you guys think? Closer to 0. Okay. So here's a little thought experiment. Where would you like to live? Country A, Gini score 0.278. So we've done, 30 seconds of instruction, right, on the Gini. Country A, 0.278. Country B, 0.457. When I ask students or when I go out and give talks, which country would they like to live in based on a limited understanding of how economists measure income inequality, what do you think most people say? They want to live in A, 0.278. Right. It seems more fair. It seems like people kind of have, again, it's this idea of a fixed pie and we all have the same slice, right? These are real Gini scores. It is the Gini score of Afghanistan versus the current Gini score of the United States. So you might want to retract your decision if you were with country A. And so my point in doing this is to help us understand that the genie doesn't help us as much as we need kind of illumination on how people are doing. Afghanistan is one of the most destitute places on the planet right now. In fact, we have to force people to go there, and they do it in the name of freedom fighting. It is a terrible place to live. Even if you're, kind of the corrupt political elite, it's not a good living, right? They're not going home and, choosing things on Netflix to watch and have all these, different beers on tap to choose from. That's not the life they lead. It's a terrible place to be. So just choosing based on the genie doesn't, again, give us an understanding of how people are doing, which is what we're really after. Are they flourishing? So just to kind of go into this a little bit more, I think the questions we have to ask are these types of questions. What does it look like to be poor in a certain country? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but right now, to be poor in the United States, and this is not being trite at all. I think if you're poor, if you're a single mother, for example, and you live in the ghetto in Detroit, you face difficult trade-offs. If your child gets sick, you might not be able to get them the medicine they need. If your tires go flat, you might not be able to fix it. You might not be able to provide daycare for all your children in the way that you want to provide it. So people who are poor in the United States face tough trade-offs, but they are not the same trade-offs that people who currently live in the Democratic Republic of the Congo face. So being in the poorest of the poor in poor countries is much worse than being in the poorest quintile in rich countries. And so the question for us as we think about income inequality globally is, how do we help other countries become better off? And how do we help people who are poor in our country become better off? But the means to those ends are quite different. What the Democratic Republic of Congo needs institutionally to get on the track of economic freedom and economic progress is much different than what we need in Detroit or in this country. So they're different questions. So there's a nuance here that we have to understand. The other question is, what are the consumption capabilities of the poor? What can someone who's poor afford? What can they have? And again, how do we always improve their lot? To talk about the genie for another minute, here's an interesting thought experiment of why I think the genie is not entirely helpful. First off, it depends on how you measure it. And we're going to talk about some more specific measurement problems. But for example, if we took the genie in this room, you might be slightly homogeneous. But if we extended it out to all of Denver, then it would be different. And if you extend that out to all of Colorado, it would be different. And if you extend that out to all of the United States, it would be different. So as you increase the number of people, the Gini score is going to change because it's a statistical measure based on the population. The other issue that we have to consider is this. So what if today we were able to round up all the income in the United States? Just take it all, put it in a big pot. We could do that. There might be some protests about it, but we could theoretically do it, right? We could take everybody's income and put it in a big bucket and then distribute it among 300 million people. So babies are getting in, everybody's going to get an income, right? $50,000 a piece. I'm just making up the numbers. I don't know if that's what it would be. So everybody's equal and we're happy, right? That's what we're after, equality. I think equality, income equality is a bad phrase to start with because nobody doesn't want to, people don't want to be unequal. We want to be equal. Well, we could do this social experiment that I'm suggesting it'd be equal on day 1. What do you think is going to happen on day 2 or day 5? Or besides that, yeah. Or year 2. It would be impossible to maintain income equality, right? Because if with my $50,000, I might do something silly like go get another, economics degree, much to my husband would protest that, right? So that's not going to show a strong accounting return right away. Some people are going to go put it all on the craps table and lose it all, right? Some people are going to put it on the craps table and win it all. So there's no way to maintain income equality because it's contrary to our human anthropology. We are not equal. And that's okay. We're diverse. We all have different skills, talents, gifts, attitudes towards risk, knowledge, all sorts of things. And that is what makes the world go round, by the way, right? So economists talk about this idea of comparative advantage, that you are good at a few things relative to other people, and it behooves you to do the things you're good at and trade for the rest. And when we can open up trade amongst anonymous strangers, then we are all richer because we can afford things we never could have made ourselves. So I really like the movie Castaway. If anybody's ever seen it, I make my students watch it sometimes, and then they think I'm cool. But then they have to write a paper about it, so it loses its luster really quickly. Has people seen it? Okay, so if you haven't seen it, I'm going to give you a quick preview. This is Tom Hanks at his finest because, most of the movie, he's the only one in it. So he's like kind of just talking to himself, and you're still just hanging on to every word. So he works for FedEx. And it's Christmas Eve, and he's proposed to his girlfriend, and life is wonderful. And he gets on a FedEx cargo plane, and it crashes on a desert island. Next day, boom, he's miserable. And he has some primary needs on that island. He needs to eat. He needs to get filtered water. He needs some shelter because it's blazingly hot in the sun. But really, he needs to get off the island, right? The funny thing is, the most pressing need you'd think that he cares about, which is getting off the island, can't even be accomplished unless the other three needs are met day in and day out, day in and day out. What am I going to eat? And so the best scene in the whole movie is when he figures out how to make fire by rubbing sticks together. And he does it once and it fails and he freaks out and then he does it again and he's victorious. And he just runs around kind of like a caveman on the beach screaming fire, 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 which I imagine is what, the first humans who discovered fire did too. They're probably excited about it. He's excited about this because it is life-changing. It is a life-changing discovery. You and I don't have to think about how to invent fire, right? You can have lighters, you have electricity, you have a stove, you have all these things that do that for you. And you don't have to know anything about it. If you had to produce everything you want to consume, you would never leave the house. Why? It's because we're different. We have different talents, different advantages. And so we're better off when we trade, but when we trade, we're going to earn different incomes. And I would argue to you that in a thriving market-based society, income inequality is part of what you get. It's natural. It's not something to be objected to, but we do tend to object to that. So let's talk a little bit more. I just want to give you a bigger picture of global income inequality. So remember, I told you the Gini score goes from 0 to 1. These are world Gini rankings. So I went through just a little thought experiment and I said, okay, 0 to 1. 1 is perfect income inequality. 0 is perfect income equality. So anything that's closer to 0, I'm deeming good. Anything that's closer to 1, I'm deeming bad or worse. So if I just pick the top 5 countries, so this is just picking them based on their Ginis, and the top and the bottom 5 countries, and then I look at their economic freedom score, which remember what I told you about economic freedom. There's lots of different indices of this, which are available free to you online. Very interesting research. But basically that is scored from 0 to 10, 10 being countries that are most free. And they measure things like the size of the government, the rule of law, property rights, level of regulation, sound money, things like this, okay? So then what I did was I said, okay, here I've arranged my Ginis, best 5, worst 5, and then I just went and looked up their economic freedom score. And as you can see, it's kind of all over the place, which was another indicator to me that Gini score doesn't tell me everything I need to know about what? Are people flourishing? How are they doing? Are they thriving? Do they, do they have shelter? Do they have food? Do they have medical care? Gini doesn't tell me any of that. So I'm thinking through this and I'm thinking as an economist, what's all the fuss? I'm not sure I understand it. As you can see, Sweden, Gini score of 0.23. That's pretty good in the way we discuss it, right? And their economic freedom score is not too bad. The question is, where are they headed? And I would say they're not headed in the right direction. But then you've got Slovenia. Very little difference in their scores. Anybody want to sign up and move to Slovenia tomorrow? Not necessarily, right? And they also have a terrible economic freedom score. So what I'm getting at here is that the Gini alone doesn't tell us what we need to know about what we're after. And what we're after is flourishing, prosperity, well-being, thriving. The problem that Tom Hanks had in Castaway was that it took every single ounce of his energy every day just to survive. There was no thriving. There was no flourishing. I got to survive today. Okay, I got to survive tomorrow. Okay, I got to survive the next day. That's not a life of flourishing. And that, again, that's what we're after. So I did another little thought experiment because I like to do this. So I looked at countries with the best economic freedom scores and the countries with the worst economic freedom scores. And then I pulled up their Ginis. So it's just organized differently. And again, you can see that the Gini score doesn't tell us everything we need to know. So Hong Kong has been topping the charts in economic freedom for decades. This is the highest score out of a 10. So nobody has a 10. Nobody even has a 9. Gini, 0.537. Slightly more unequal than the United States, but much better in economic freedom. So again, I do this because I want to understand what are the measures that we have at our disposal and how helpful are they? And to me, the Gini isn't as helpful as I think in terms related to the emphasis that we put on it. But economists like numbers. And so they throw these numbers out and then they rely on them. And I think, again, it means that we stop thinking, and we can't do that. Okay, so here's a graph of the U.S. Gini since 1913, which is really when we started getting kind of good macro data. And as you can see, just as a reminder, it goes from 0 to 1. So this is to scale. If you look at these changes, they are minor in real terms. So we've hovered between 0.4 and 0.5. And you can see at the height of the Great Depression, we were just a hair above 0.5. So this, again, isn't very robust in what it tells me, because the Great Depression was a time of terrible loss for people. Lots of widespread poverty. People had nothing. They were taking wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread. We don't want to live in that. So 0.51 could be really bad. But, look at times of more lots more economic freedom, more prosperity. It's not that much different than the 0.51. So again, we have to understand what we're after.
I was just wondering where the bump is from the 17 trillion war on poverty in there.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting too. We'll talk about that in a minute. 50-year anniversary.
Zoom in, you'll see a hockey graph.
Yeah. We're going to see a hockey stick in a minute. And how we calculate the Gini matters as well. I have a paper on this. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically I already talked about population size. There's no legitimate reason to expect that a country the size of the United States should have the same Gini as a country the size of Sweden. 9 million people versus 300 million people. There's no reason to expect that they would have something close. So we have to compare apples to apples. And just to say Sweden has this, 0.23, United States has 0.457, United States, you should be more like Sweden. There's no reason to come to that conclusion just based on the Gini, okay? Taxes and transfers. So the other key issue, which, as you know, if you've paid attention to the income inequality debate, there's a French economist that's getting all the libertarians, myself included, riled up. I'm shocked, by the way. His name is Piketty, and he wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. Don't buy it. 700 pages. It makes a good, if you need to prop the door open. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And he's under fire right now for the way he did his data. So I won't talk about that because I'm not the expert there. But part of the problem is this. We have a social safety net in this country, and the way that social, and also a very bloated government, which I don't need to tell you, but the way that we do that, the way that we do government, the way that we do social welfare programs is to tax from some and transfer to others, right? So if you pay taxes, some of your taxes are going to go to Social Security. They're going to go to give someone a food stamp. They're going to go to other in-kind benefits. So the government can't create wealth. This is, when I say that in some audiences, it's shocking to people, but they can. The government is not, they're not in the business of making toothbrushes by day and they sell the profits at night and they give you food stamps. No. They have to take money from somewhere else and then reallocate it. So there's an opportunity cost associated with that always. But if we count the genie and we don't deduct what you paid and add to what we gave you, we're actually not going to measure income inequality properly. Does that make sense? So if I pay 30% of my income goes away, that needs to be deducted from my income. And whatever goes to other people needs to be added to theirs. And so Piketty and others in some of their historical research have not always counted taxes and transfers. And that's not legitimate because it exacerbates the genie towards more inequality. And then demographic changes really matter. And this gets to freedom. I mean, in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, what happened? Women entered the workforce in droves. And the reason that happened was partly because the laws changed, but the culture changed so that there was more acceptance of women. I'm happy about that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to be an economist, right? So you might not be happy about that. We'll have to see how you think about my talk. But these demographic changes changed the genie because of the way we measure household income. So if you go from 1940, you have one income earner in a house, and now you have two income earners in a house, that could change the Gini scores. And you could actually imagine a world where it made the Gini worse, but it actually made people better off. And so we have to, again, the Gini, I'm pounding on it tonight, but with good reason. It doesn't tell us everything we need to know. So I think we need to switch the conversation to income mobility. Income mobility, not income inequality. I really think that income inequality is a red herring. I think it gets us down, a rabbit hole that doesn't get us anywhere good policy-wise. Because when I listen to policymakers talk about the solutions to income inequality, it's always wealth redistribution in some form or another. Wealth redistribution does not jumpstart economic progress. If it did, we'd be really rich. It doesn't, right? There's always an opportunity cost. So income mobility is a better measure to help us understand, again, how people are doing. What is their ability to move out of the bottom income quintile? When I say quintile, we just, as economists, when we look at this, we divide the society or the whatever population we're looking at into fifths. So being in the bottom quintile means you're in the bottom 20%, right? There's not a lot of data on this, unfortunately, because as you can imagine, to do it, you have to track unique individuals over many years. So it takes a long time to get the data. And so many people just kind of substitute data in there and make assumptions, and I think that's dangerous. So we don't have a lot of good data on this. We do have this report from the Treasury, and it measured people from 1996 to 2007. It measured the same people over time. That's key to understanding how people are doing as well. You need to track how I'm doing as a 15-year-old is going to be different than how I'm doing as a 25-year-old and different than how I'm doing as a 35-year-old, right? And we should expect that. So income mobility, this study helped us understand that in just 9 years, 1996 to 2005, 90.5% of this study, of these people observed, were not in the lowest income quintile after just 9 years. So I think that's good, right? I'd like it to be better. I'd like it to be faster. And I'd like whoever's in the lowest income quintile, to still be able to afford more. Those, I think, are the more helpful conversations. So as you look at it, as you go up in quintiles, it's harder to move, which makes sense too, right? If you're in the fourth quintile, it's probably hard to become the top or the top 1%. We've seen more conversation among economists around this topic, and I hope that leads to better research because I think we need to understand it better. But, everybody talks about upward income mobility. So, for example, my first job, I think I had when I was 15. I had 2 jobs that summer because I'm an overachiever, and my parents told me I had to buy my own clothes. And so I worked at George Washington's house. I'm from Alexandria, Virginia. I worked in the gift shop, which was kind of a funny first job. And then I also worked at Baskin-Robbins. I don't know if you guys have that, ice cream shop. Okay. So I start there. I'm 15 years old. They take a chance on me. But, I look back on my 15-year-old self and I think, wow, you're brave. And I really hope, when my children are 15, that somebody will take that brave chance, because I didn't know anything, right? I don't know how to use a cash register. I can count, but I might, not do the change properly. I could cost a small business owner a lot of money. So taking a chance on me was actually great, because it got me, the way I think about it is got me on the economic ladder. So you need a jump start. You have to get on the economic ladder, and then you have to climb. And the climbing is a lot of our own responsibility, but it's also that we need to live in a society that doesn't make the climbing hard by excessive regulation, by excessive taxation, by making it hard for businesses to open. All these types of things hurt upward mobility. So with saying that, I would also tell you that we don't tend to focus on negative income mobility, but we should, because it's just as important. It is very important to me that the top 1%, okay, because this is who the media talks about all the time, the top 1% in just 9 years, 25% of them were not in the top 1% anymore. That's good. And here's why. If Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or any mega billionaire gets to become a billionaire and then rest on their laurels and not have to work hard for the profits that they seek, we're in trouble. The only reason that they should get to be billionaires is because they have made life-altering innovations that make our lives better. And the only reason that we can expect them to do that is not depend on altruism, but to actually use the profit and loss mechanism to foster creativity, entrepreneurship, technological innovation, because again, this is what makes people's lives better. So negative income mobility is important. And if you see people who get to the top and they get to stay on top forever, then we should be worried. And so this gets me to kind of another part of my research that I'm focusing on, which is bad income inequality. I made the case, I've spent the first part of this talk making the case that income inequality is part of a thriving market economy. And I believe that. But I also think that there's some income inequality that's bad. Objectively bad and subjectively bad, which is based on this idea of cronyism, which is when the large companies set up shop. I'm from right outside of Washington, D.C., and you should just see K Street. K Street is where lobbyists go make homes. And they spend all their time, millions and millions of dollars, on high-powered attorneys that lobby for their interests at the expense of other people. And I'm going to make a case in a minute for you as to why I think that's really bad and particularly harmful for the poor. But before we leave this topic of income mobility, I want to talk about one other measure that I think is helpful, which is consumption equality. This gets to, again, when we're thinking about flourishing, right? That's kind of how my mind is thinking about this stuff. Consumption equality, what does that mean? Well, what can people purchase? What can they buy with their money? And if you listen to, some of our friends on the left in the media, they would tell you that people were better off in 1970 than they are now. I'm not sure I totally understand that, but I think that, we can put romantic kind of glasses on the past and say life was better, life was easier, life was simpler. Here, I'm going to give you an example of why that's not right, and this is not mine. I don't know if you've heard of Don Boudreaux. Don Boudreaux is an economist at George Mason, and Russ Roberts, who's at the Hoover Institute. They have a blog called Cafe Hayek. It's great. And they had, this is a blog issue that came out, I think, April 1st. And it's called The Price is Righter. Anybody seen The Price is Right? It's a game show. Bob Barker. Okay. So come on down. That's right. Consumption equality. This is my little story of how things are actually much better than they were in 1970. So in 1972, that's when The Price is Right debuted. And as you know, if you watch this game show, you have to guess the price of stuff. And, it's kind of like household consumables and things like this. Things that normal people would buy, like a stovetop range. So in 1972, Bob Barker rolls out this stovetop range, and somebody has to guess the price of it. Well, as it turns out, in 1972, this stove, this is an actual image of the stove. It's kind of ugly. So I'm just happy that they don't have a racing stripe down the middle anymore. It cost $382. $382 in 1972. In 1972, the average earnings or wages for a non-supervisory manufacturing laborer. Okay, so that's somebody who's going to be in the middle to lower income quintiles. Non-supervisory manufacturing type work. So we're talking about factories, these types of things. That average wage was $3.90 an hour. So in 1972, it took you 99 work hours to earn the stove. 99 hours. That's assuming you don't need to eat for a week, have shelter for a week, nothing. So it actually took you more than 99 hours to acquire the stove, right? Because you can't just not eat for a week or pay your rent because you need the stove. That's a long time. Same stove. I found this on, Home Depot or something. Today, that stove is about $340, which I found interesting. The price has not gone down dramatically, and that's where our friends on the left would say, see, people were better off in 1970. But it's the labor hours required to get the stove, which have dramatically changed. So right now, same worker, non-supervisory, manufacturing sector, average wage, $20.88. So this stove can be acquired in about 16 hours. That's vastly different. This is, I think, a much better picture of helping us understand what people can acquire and what it takes them to get those things. By the way, this kind of item hasn't changed that much. But think about something like a smartphone. Now, I'm using my smartphone right here to time myself so I don't talk too long. I use it to buy things on Amazon. It's my alarm in the morning. This smartphone wasn't even a possibility for the richest person on the planet in 1972. Not even possible. Not even in the choice set. We couldn't even think of it. Anybody seen the movie Wall Street? Great movie. So what's the guy, Gordon Gekko? It's Michael Douglas, right? Michael Douglas. One of my favorites. There's a lot of good scenes in that movie. But, he's this high-powered jerk who stomps on the little guy, and he's walking up and down the beach at his Hamptons private home, and he's talking on a cell phone. And it's this big, and it's in a bag. So he's carrying a bag around his shoulder. That was the old crossbody bag, right? He's carrying this bag, and it has a cord, and that's his cell phone. The richest of the rich, and that movie was filmed in 1984. The richest of the rich had very archaic phones in 1974, let alone 1972. So the thing is, flourishing, part of that is about how much work it takes us, what labor hours are required to get the stuff we want. But not only that, it's thinking about what the stuff is that's available to us that wasn't even an idea in 1972, or was an idea that was so expensive it wasn't possible. So I think, again, these things are better measures of how people are doing in global flourishing. This is the hockey stick graph. One of my favorites. I can't go anywhere and not show this thing. So there's an economist at Berkeley, Brad DeLong, and he's actually done this, and he takes it like 2 million years BC, looking at income inequality. I'm not that brave with my graphing skills. But and you can imagine we didn't have good data collection back then, but this is basically right, world GDP from AD 1 till now. So 2,000 years of human history. Most of human history has been a struggle to survive, and not a very successful struggle. Most people died early and often for most of human history. It is only until very recently that the planet has changed, and for the better. I mean, right now, the president of the World Bank is saying that we're going to eliminate abject poverty by 2030 on the planet. Abject poverty is living under $1.25 a day or less. That's an amazing feat. If the president of the World Bank in 1980 had made that claim, he would have been debunked as an economist and fired, because half of the planet lived in abject poverty or close to it just 40 years ago. So we've made amazing strides. And this is where I want us to think about the big picture. I think income inequality gets us down in the weeds of something that's not helpful. I think the big picture is, how do we get more freedom for more people as fast as possible so they can get more stuff that makes their lives better? That's the question. Thanks. So I'm going to end kind of talking about cronyism, because I really think this is the issue of the day. I think it's a big problem, and I don't know how to solve it. So we need smart people thinking about this. Cronyism, I would define as typically large businesses because they have excess capital that they can spend to lobby. This is a word economists use. They call it rent seeking, but I think cronyism is better. When I think of cronyism, I think of guys smoking cigars in some sort of alley or back, kind of wood paneled room doing naughty things. And that's the metaphor or mental image I want you to have. And it's the difference. It goes back to the woman's sign that I showed you when I started talking. Cronyism is, if not a zero-sum game, it's surely a negative-sum game because not everybody can play. That's the problem. If you're a small business, you don't have millions of dollars to set up shop on K Street to protect your interests at the expense of someone else. That's not how a market economy and how free trade works. And so I think we're in an excessive culture of cronyism, of rent seeking. There's tons and tons of examples. I just have a few here. The absolute, kind of protest against Uber. I don't understand. Yeah. Airbnb, same things. Cash for clunkers. Here's the thing and you guys get it, but I think this is where we need to be articulate spokesmen for liberty. That's our job. Most people didn't look at cash for clunkers and say, oh my gosh, that's cronyism. This is terrible. We've got to stop this right now. And I think that's the kind of reaction we need to have. We have got to stop this. Because the problem with cash for clunkers, it sounds like it's great. It's done under the name of environmental stewardship, and environmental stewardship is a good thing. But at what cost? That's the economic question. It's not good at the cost of taking a perfectly good resource, pouring sodium silicate in the engine, and then smashing it and taking it off the planet. That hurts poor people. Do you know who it benefited? Honda. They're already rich. So the point is, when you do some digging, you can see who's behind these types of legislations, right? The recent light bulb bill, which GE in Sylvania basically manufactured in Congress, making incandescent light bulbs illegal and insisting, basically giving themselves monopoly privileges over new light bulb technology that they happen to have patents for. That's cronyism. If it smells like it, it is it. But the problem is, how do we undo it? Because you can't ask Congress to do that because that's like asking the fox to watch the hen house. It's not going to happen. They're the beneficiaries of it. But what I would say, especially when I think about Uber, by the way, my birthday was in February, and a few girlfriends and I went to I live in Loudoun County, which has some vineyards that pretend to be good, and they're okay. It's not like here or California, but they're okay. So we decided to take an Uber. We didn't want to drive, so we took an Uber, and I was so excited because I talk about it all the time, and I think the woman wanted to kind of kick me out of her car. I'm like, this is so exciting. I can't believe this. And she's like, just pay me and get out. But what was fascinating about my Uber experience that day was this was a woman. She was African American. She was probably 60 years old, and she had a perfectly clean Toyota Camry. And she said, this is what I do to make extra money for my family. This is what I call a micro business opportunity. Why would we want to take that away from people? We wouldn't if we're after flourishing. But, here's what I would say to you. We all love Uber right now, right? Because they're the new kids on the block. They're kind of pushing out the monopolistic taxi companies. But if Uber could secure for themselves the sweet deal that most local cab companies have, they would. Because they're just responding to incentives. And so they are, exactly. So how do we stop this culture of getting protection from the state? I don't know, but that's what we need to think about it. And the state, right? That's hard too. So I would say this is a vicious cycle. Basically, the problem I have with this is that government regulation begets more government regulation, which begets more. And we get into growing size and scope of government that generates bad income inequality. So what we're going to have to do if we're going to have a real honest conversation about income inequality is say, what's the good kind? What's the bad kind? How do I elevate the good and hurt the bad? And that's why as an economist, I can't tell you if 0.457 as a Gini score is good, bad, or ugly. I have no idea. It really depends, right? It depends on what country we're talking about. It depends on the institutions. So I think we need to dig deeper in terms of that conversation. But the vicious cycle of rent seeking, more government, more rent seeking, people are just going to the trough. And until we cut off the supply, it's going to be hard. So I want to end with a story. This is another sign from the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I couldn't agree with this woman more. I love her sign. I don't mind you being rich. I mind you buying my government. That's the stand we need to take about income inequality. It's not so much the absolute difference between what Bill Gates makes and what I make. I don't really care. In fact, if he wasn't around, I have a Dell, so it has Outlook on it. And so I'm using his products. If Bill Gates wasn't around, I wouldn't be able to do lots of stuff. And my husband would tell you I can barely turn my computer on. I'm not very tech savvy. But he made my life better, and he made the lives of many, many, many millions of people better because he innovated. He had to serve us. So we have to foster that culture. The net result of cronyism are these things: generating bad income inequality. But I would say this: it disproportionately hurts the poor. And again, I will say to you, as somebody who goes and speaks a lot, I think what economists have failed at is we haven't made the case that income inequality is really a story about flourishing and prosperity, not about protecting the rich. Because when we say, yeah, we're pro-income inequality, I mean, you're going to put that bumper sticker on your car? I would, but I'm not running for office. So, if you're running for office, I don't know that I would advise that. But we need to say that it institutionalizes theft and it hurts the poor. And that's the problem. It harms opportunities for all of us if we thwart micro business opportunities. So to me, it's all about economic freedom. I think this is a much better understanding of how a society is doing, what's its trajectory, what can we expect, and where does it need to improve. So I'd like to end with a little personal story. Economic freedom saves lives. This is why I am so passionate. Hopefully you've gotten that vibe from me tonight. I'm very passionate about this. It's why I teach. It's why I write. And I would say to you that the beauty of economic freedom is that it saves our lives in benign ways. What do I mean by that? This is a picture. Where is this kid? Anybody else feel like that at the dentist? Yeah. I hate going to the dentist. I hate it. And I freak out. And my dentist always says, am I hurting you right now, or are you anticipating pain? And I always say, I'm anticipating. I'm ready. And I'm sure he wants to kick me out, but I don't like going to the dentist. But the thing is that dentistry saves lives. In fact, we're so rich, I'm so rich, that I get to hate going to a guy who is my hero and should be in a cape. Right? So, of all the medical advances over the past 200 years, dentistry is the one that has elongated our lives the most. Most people don't think that. They think it's heart research, heart surgery, cancer research. Nope. It's dentistry. Because in 1750, if you had a rotten tooth, you could be dead at the age of 25. You didn't have a toothbrush. You didn't have toothpaste. You didn't have fluoride in your water. You were just dead. So go back to the Castaway movie. There's a scene in there where he has to actually give himself a root canal with an ice skate. It's not pleasant. Right now, I just get to go sit in the chair. I get all numbed up. I freak out about the drill. And I get to probably live till at least 80. That's a small price to pay for that, right? Economic freedom saves our lives, and we are ignorant of it. And there's bliss in the ignorance. We are ignorant beneficiaries of the goods and services we consume day in and day out, and that's what helps us flourish. So it's going to save your life in benign ways all the time. But there might be ways in which it kind of smacks you right in the face. And here's my story. So this is a picture of my daughter, who's now 23 months. So the story has a happy ending. I was actually supposed to speak at a FWE conference the summer that I was going to have her, and I had to cancel because my water broke at 26 weeks, which is extremely dangerous. And I was taken to the hospital that night, and the local hospital in my area where my OB had privileges said, if she survives, this is what you can expect. Major issues, debilitating problems. She might not survive. And by the way, our hospital can't take a 26-month-old newborn. We're not prepared. Our NICU is not sophisticated. That's called a micro-preemie. So they put me in an ambulance, got me to Fairfax Hospital, which is a teaching hospital, has a very good NICU. And every single day, all I could do, in fact, every 4 hours of every day, they came by and monitored me. Took my temperature, took my blood pressure, listened to the baby, because what they were doing is trying to see if she was in distress, or had it, because if I had a temperature, it probably meant she had some sort of infection or that I did. And we were going to go into immediate C-section. So every 4 hours when somebody was coming in, I was scared. I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And I was on hospital bed rest for 5 weeks. Did nothing. I mean, I had my laptop, so that was good. My poor husband was at home with our then 3-year-old son, day in and day out. I couldn't do anything. Nothing. There was nothing I could do for her except lay there. And all I could think about, and I'm not just making this up, I'm not, is what if I was in Bangladesh right now? That's all I could think about the whole time. Why am I so lucky that I'm in this sophisticated hospital with tubes everywhere and doctors everywhere and nurses coming in and machinery and equipment? I don't understand any of it. I can't do anything but lay there and trust these people who I don't know. And the life of my child is at stake. And if I'm in Bangladesh right now, I'm dead and she's dead, most likely. Most likely. So her story is that she was born at 31 weeks in the middle of the night, and she then lived in the NICU for 5 weeks. And preemies have a couple problems. One is they can't regulate their body temperature. 2 is they can't eat, and they can't regulate their heart rate. So that's what all this stuff is going on around her. She has a feeding tube in her nose. She has this kind of bubble blanket around her, which is regulating her temperature. And she has lots of probes, which you can see at the bottom, that are monitoring her heart rate. And every time they have a heart rate crash, people run and alarms go off. It's very scary. It's moment to moment. But she's alive. And she's alive, and I had nothing to do with it. I am an ignorant beneficiary of all those medical services that saved her life. So economic freedom directly probably saved my life, definitely saved hers, and I had nothing to do with it. So the thing is, who cares about income inequality? Let's get more of this for more people everywhere, as much as possible, because it elongates our lives, and it gives, now my daughter has a chance to flourish. No guaranteed outcomes, but she has a shot. And in many places still in the world, there's no chance here. This is hopeless. So I think I'm just going to finish by saying income inequality makes for lots of good cocktail talk, but I don't think it's actually going to help us get more prosperity or get more flourishing. I think what we really need to focus on, opportunities for everybody, but particularly the poor. We've got to roll back regulations. We got to stomp out this bad income inequality. And if we can do those things, which I think we can, we have a chance. I mean, the hockey stick graph shows it all, right? We've made a lot of progress. It's an amazing time to be alive. And so I think there's more hope than there ever has been, but I think we have real problems in cronyism that we need to address. And we have to get serious about those if we're going to get better and have more flourishing. And I will stop there because I'm probably over time. Sorry.